Hey everybody, Barrett Lee back here, and we are moving on in our discussion of the theistic proofs to talk about the second of the three. We already talked about the ontological, so now we're going to talk about the cosmological argument for God's existence. Cosmological comes from the word cosmology, which is the study of the cosmos, the study of the universe. Specifically, it's an argument that arises from the fact that there is a universe. We look around, we observe that, hey, there's stuff here. Look, I'm sitting in this restaurant right now, and there's people walking around, and there's stuff in the room. Stuff exists. Well, where did all this stuff come from? It's probably a question that everybody's asked at one point or another in their life. I have a 2-year-old daughter right now who loves asking why in this kind of infinite series of questions. So, we're watching Elmo, and she'll go, "Elmo's sad?" I'm like, "Yes, Elmo is sad." "Why?" "Well, because he got scared." "Well, why?" "Well, because Mr. Hooper's store caught on fire." "Why?" "Well, I guess somebody didn't clean the grease trap." "Well, why?" "Well, I guess they got too busy." And it'll go on and on and on and on and on. Why, why? That's how the cosmological argument works. Everybody wonders where they come from, and that sort of logically leads to asking the question of where does everything come from? And the cosmological argument for God's existence tries to explain that. So, a good image for understanding the cosmological argument would be to imagine a row of dominoes, and specifically one that's in the process of falling over. If we look at the domino that's lined up at the end of the row, then when we see that fall over, we're going to look at that and say, okay, what caused that domino to fall over? And when we look at it, we'll say, well, it was the domino immediately before that one. That one fell over and knocked it and caused it to fall over. Well, what caused that one to fall over? Well, it was the domino before that, and the domino before that, before that, before that, before that, before that, all the way back to the beginning. But then you ask the question, well, what got all these dominoes falling over in the first place? All right, well, take that same argument, take that same question and apply that to the universe. What caused all of this stuff to come into existence and to work the way it does? Where does all of this stuff come from? Well, the proponents of the cosmological argument would say that, well, it all comes from God. There had to be some first cause that caused all of these beings and all of these events to get set in motion. So that's an image to sort of get us started thinking about the cosmological argument. Next, I thought I would outline the argument just like we outlined the ontological argument. So it goes like this. First, we can observe in this universe things that are dependent. In other words, they depend on something else to cause their existence. So, a child, we know, is born from its mother. It is a dependent being. A baby can't give birth to itself. It has to be given birth from another being, from another person. But likewise, objects like this computer and this camera that I'm talking to you on right now, it didn't cause itself to come into existence. Somebody made it. Somebody did the research and found out how to put a camera on a computer screen, and they figured out what kind of designs that they would want to put in that, and then they put it all together. Somebody wrote a program so that I could record things on my computer, and then somebody in a factory assembled it somewhere and put it on the shelf and sold it to me. All of these people worked together to cause this computer, this object, to come into existence. So we would call that a dependent being. Things that come about as the result of cause and effect. And as I said, too, we can also observe that nothing can cause itself. At least no dependent being can cause itself to exist. All of these things depend on something else. There can't be an infinite regress of causes. Now, infinite regress, let's break that word down a little bit. A regress is the opposite of progress. If you have progress, you're moving forward. And so if you're making a regress, then you're moving backwards. So an infinite regress is to go backwards infinity. And when we're talking about it here, we're talking about looking at those series of causes, looking at the dominoes that were lined up, as it were, and something inside of us says, well, something had to get all of this going. This line of dominoes falling over can't go back to infinity. So it's got to end somewhere, and somewhere at that beginning point, something set all these dominoes up and started them falling over. So what was it? What was that first cause? So there can't be an infinite regress of causes. Aquinas, in today's readings on the cosmological argument, says, well, if there were an infinite regress of causes, then there would be no first cause to set the whole thing in motion, and so nothing would have ever started in motion, and since nothing ever started, then it would never have a finishing result. But since we see that there is a finishing result, i.e., we exist, something must have started everything. So there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. Therefore, there exists an uncaused first cause. In other words, there has to exist some kind of being that is not dependent on something outside of itself for its existence. So somewhere as it were, a baby that could give birth to itself, we could say. That doesn't make any sense when we're talking about ourselves as human beings, or any object that we might create. These are all dependent beings, but there's got to be some kind of independent being that necessarily exists of its own accord and must have existed from all eternity, that at some point decided to act and got everything moving. So, if there is, the way the argument goes, namely through Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas makes the jump to say, well, this first cause, this uncaused, independent being, must be God. And you can kind of see why he would jump there. But that's how he arrives at his argument. That's how he lands the cosmological argument for God's existence. Now, there are a few objections to this. First of all, people look at that question of an infinite regress. Why can't there be an infinite regress? There could still even potentially be a God if there were an infinite regress of causes. It could stretch back to infinity forever and ever and ever. Simply imagine that this causal being, this uncaused independent being, exists completely outside of that series and is simply causing it as it is, going back to infinity and forward to infinity. But this being, which would not be bound by the laws of time, is therefore the cause of the whole series, but is not part of the series. So that's one objection that people make, is, there could be an infinite regress. Why not? There are those who argue that explaining each individual cause is sufficient to explain the cause of the whole. So, so we observe that each object and each being, each person in reality is a dependent being, but that doesn't mean that the whole series of causes itself is a dependent being. That would be like saying that your entire collection of stamps was a stamp itself. Well, no, that wouldn't be right. It's a book that's full of stamps. If anybody collects stamps anymore, I don't know if they do, but if you do, good for you. Have a hobby. So explaining each individual cause is sufficient. There are those who try to argue that there could very well be an infinite regress of causes. And then finally, the next objection to the cosmological argument is that even if there's not an infinite regress, even if there is needs to be a cause, and there is an independent, uncaused being that got all of this in motion, there's no reason why that has to be God. All that really needs to happen is for something to start everything. That being could have started things and then promptly walked away or died. It doesn't necessarily need to be one being. There could have been lots of them. You could have this whole pantheon of gods. This being doesn't need to be good or all-powerful, just really, really powerful. This being doesn't need to be immortal. It could be that God started everything and promptly died. So there's nothing in there that says that this first cause must necessarily correspond to this idea that that when I say we, I say that people in philosophical circles conceive of as God. Um, so it could really be anything. The cosmological argument really just needs something to get everything moving, and then the being can go take a nap if it wants to. And so to automatically associate the idea of a first cause with the all-powerful, loving, and immortal God that is worshipped by many religions around the world, well, that's an illogical leap. As some folks would say, you can't get there from here. So those are some of the criticisms of the cosmological argument. And next we're going to be moving on to talk about the teleological argument. So I will see you there.